My name is Joanne Rivera. I'm 67 years old, and on the very day I hosted a family party they all promised to attend, not a single person came. Only for me to find out that my daughter-in-law was smiling on social media from a cruise ship with the entire family, and what I did next, well, let's just say she won't be smiling like that again. You'd think that after raising a child, standing by through every flu, every scraped knee, every teenage meltdown and college heartbreak, the least life could offer you in return is a full room on your birthday, or at least a slice of cake with your name spelled right and one real hug that didn't feel like a favor. But what I got that afternoon was silence, thick and humming, interrupted only by the slow ticking of my old kitchen clock and the nervous breath I let out every time I thought I heard a car pull into the driveway. I had started preparing 2 days earlier like I always did, measuring out the ingredients for my sweet corn casserole by memory, cleaning the dusty silver serving trays that hadn't seen daylight since my late husband Martin passed, and blowing up the balloons I'd bought in cheerful pastel colors because I knew my youngest granddaughter liked pink and mint green. The house smelled like comfort and time, rosemary roast chicken, fresh-baked peach cobbler, and a hint of lemon-scented polish from the sideboard I'd rubbed down the night before. The table was set for 7. I'd printed little name cards because I thought it'd make the kids laugh. I even put a sparkly gold paper crown in the center seat for my daughter-in-law, Candice. She liked to feel important. It wasn't supposed to be a big deal, just a small Sunday gathering, something warm and easy before school started again, a way to bring us all together before fall settled in with its chill and short days. I'd called it a family day, not a birthday, even though the calendar said otherwise. Maybe because I didn't want anyone to feel obligated, or maybe because I didn't want to admit even to myself how badly I needed not to feel forgotten. By 2 in the afternoon, I'd changed my sweater 3 times and reapplied my lipstick with trembling fingers. By 3, the roasted vegetables had gone cold. At 4, I stopped opening the front curtains every 10 minutes. And by 5, I turned off the music. I sat down at the kitchen table with my hands folded like I was waiting for a prayer to arrive. My phone was on the placemat beside me. No missed calls, no new messages. Just the default wallpaper of a field of daisies I'd never actually been to. I pressed the screen just to make sure the notifications weren't stuck. They weren't. It wasn't until almost 6 that I saw it, scrolling aimlessly through social media, because what else can a woman do when her heart's so sore it feels hollow? A photo popped up on my feed, Candice's feed to be exact. Her perfectly filtered smile, leaning against my son Michael's shoulder, surrounded by the whole extended family, his cousins, her sisters, the grandkids, all of them holding fruity drinks on the deck of a cruise ship. The caption read, "Best week ever. No drama, just love. Hashtag, das are family first. Hashtag, unbothered." I just sat there and stared, feeling like I'd walked into a stranger's life, like I was watching someone else's story unfold while mine withered on the vine. There was my granddaughter, the one who once begged me to tuck her in every night for a week straight, wearing a new sequin dress and grinning like Christmas came early. And there was my son, the boy I'd sacrificed everything for after his father died, his hand resting gently on the small of Candice's back. Not a trace of guilt in his eyes, just the sun. I didn't cry right away. That came later, much later, when the dishwasher was humming and the leftover cake was already packed into containers I knew I'd probably toss. But in that moment, I didn't scream or call or post a passive-aggressive comment. I did something I didn't expect. I smiled. Not because I was okay, but because I knew something they didn't. You see, a few weeks earlier, I'd been cleaning the upstairs bathroom while the kids were visiting. Candice had left in a hurry with the girls, and I went in to tidy up like I always did after guests. And that's when I found it. My grandson's toothbrush. Nothing unusual there, except this one looked brand new, like it hadn't been used at all, and had someone else's name sticker still half peeled on the handle. I don't know why that stuck with me. Maybe because I knew she always liked things branded and monogrammed, and this wasn't hers. Or maybe because the timing was strange. Michael had been out of town 9 months before the boy was born. He'd told me they were reconnecting. But I remembered the tear-stained calls, the week he stayed on my couch, the distance that had grown like moss between them. It sat like a pebble in my shoe for weeks, small but impossible to ignore. And when Candice dropped off the kids one weekend and left the baby sleeping in the car seat while she went to get coffee, I did something I never imagined myself doing. I took a cotton swab, gently swiped the inside of the baby's cheek, and mailed it in with a DNA kit I'd ordered under a pseudonym. I didn't tell anyone, not even my best friend Margaret, who I played bridge with every other Tuesday, and who would have told me to stop watching daytime TV and start going to church again. I just waited and waited until the envelope came, white, unmarked, plain as truth. And now, sitting there in my empty kitchen, bathed in the glow of a screen filled with people who decided I was unnecessary, I realized that I wasn't sad. I was ready. Because if they thought that erasing me from their picture would make them safer from their secrets, they'd forgotten one very important thing. I was the one who gave birth to their center, and I still held the thread. As I sat there in my kitchen, still dressed in the soft lavender sweater I had ironed just for them, the party decorations sagging and the scent of baked peaches growing cold in the air, the silence around me wasn't just empty. It was instructive, because when a family decides to pretend you no longer exist, they never imagine that you might be the one holding the sharpest truth of all. That truth was already in my house, tucked inside a plain white envelope that had arrived 3 days earlier and sat untouched on the corner of my entry table, quiet and patient like a coiled breath, waiting to be released. I hadn't opened it right away, not because I was afraid of what it might say, but because I already knew what it would confirm, and there's a kind of power in letting the truth linger just a little longer before turning it loose. When I finally unfolded the paper, alone, steady, I saw exactly what I expected. Lines of clinical language and hard numbers that cut deeper than any insult ever could. The words were simple, final, and impossibly clean. Probability of parentage, 0%. No asterisks, no maybe, no room for doubt. I stared at those numbers as the sunlight shifted across the kitchen floor and touched the table where 7 untouched name cards still sat, each one written in my own careful cursive, including the one with glittered edges that said Candice, placed right in front of the gold paper crown I'd picked up as a little joke to make her feel special, as if any effort I made had ever truly mattered to her. I didn't cry, didn't scream, didn't even feel surprise. All I felt was stillness, the kind that comes after a long drought, when even the clouds above are too tired to promise rain. I sat there with the truth folded neatly in my lap and let the memory of 100 little things come rushing back. Her sudden mood swings, her convenient silences, the way she'd once asked Michael if he thought maybe I needed help remembering things when I brought up the odd timing of the baby's birth, or how she always acted like I was too soft, too sentimental, too involved. And Michael, my sweet son, the boy I raised with everything I had left after Martin passed, the one who used to run barefoot through the house asking me why I cried at the end of movies. He had no idea what Candice had built around him, how she'd twisted his loyalty into blindness and kept him dancing at the edge of her narrative without ever letting him look down to see what it was made of. He'd been traveling for work when she conceived, gone for weeks, and I remember how when he returned, she suddenly glowed with purpose, brushing off any questions with that voice she used when she wanted people to stop thinking and start obeying. Still, I said nothing. Not then, not after the envelope arrived, not even after I opened it and felt the sharp chill of confirmation cut through the last threads of doubt that had held me back. Instead, I moved quietly, carefully, folding the results back into their envelope and making 3 copies. One I locked in my home safe beside Martin's old watch, One I placed inside a sealed folder and handed off discreetly to Margaret's cousin, who practiced law down in Naples and owed me a favor, and one I tucked into a linen-bound photo album beneath a snapshot of Michael at age 5, his little fingers holding up a cardboard sign that said, "World's Best Mom" in glitter glue. I didn't call anyone. I didn't send a message. I simply smiled, the way Candice always did when she was pretending nothing was wrong, and I began to watch more closely than ever before. Over the next few days, I went through Candice's social media the way a librarian reads a mystery novel, with quiet patience and sharp attention, noting every face in every photo, every caption dripping with hollow affection, every hashtag that screamed wholeness while the truth beneath it curled and rotted. I noticed a man's name that kept reappearing, not loudly, not obviously, but tucked into the corners of casual banter, in comments that read like jokes but felt like codes, and suddenly all the missing pieces that had once seemed like coincidence began to lock together with a soundless snap. She'd covered her tracks well, but not perfectly, and I'd lived long enough to know what women like Candice fear the most isn't confrontation, it's exposure. So I began gathering. Not vengeance, not anger, just facts, small truths folded neatly into folders, screenshots saved and labeled, quiet inquiries made through women I trusted, like Mrs. Landry at church, whose niece worked at the same private school Candice had recently mentioned. When I asked if tuition there was steep, she confided, without knowing the weight of her words, that Candice had submitted financial paperwork suggesting she was the sole provider. And just like that, another piece slid into place. Michael was working long hours doing everything he could to support what he thought was his family, and meanwhile she was crafting herself as a struggling hero, spinning sympathy while hiding deception behind matching outfits and curated smiles. But even then, I didn't raise my voice. I didn't confront. I didn't try to force a moment that hadn't yet earned its full silence. Instead, I waited. I cleaned the house like always. I checked in with friends. I even left warm-hearted comments on her cruise photos, letting her believe she had won whatever game she thought we were playing, because I knew Sunday was coming. I knew their ship would dock, their phones would light up, and they'd return to the quiet neighborhood where I had sat alone on the day they pretended I didn't exist. And I knew I would be standing there when they did. Not to beg, not to accuse, not even to ask why, but to hand her an envelope with a smile so calm it would make her skin crawl, because sometimes justice doesn't need a stage or a scream or a spotlight. Sometimes it just needs a grandmother with a memory, a truth too sharp to ignore, and the kind of silence that no lie can survive. I knew exactly when they pulled into the driveway, not because I was looking through the window, I wasn't, but because I felt the quiet change, like the shift in air before a summer storm, when the stillness isn't peaceful anymore, but heavy and waiting. The sound of tires on gravel broke the rhythm of my thoughts, and somewhere in the background the porch wind chime gave a single, trembling note, as if even it understood that something was about to fall out of place. I was sitting in my usual chair, hands folded over the envelope, my face calm, my back straight, the kind of still posture you learn over years of being ignored without losing your presence entirely. I didn't move right away. I waited for the sound of the car door, the excited voices of the girls, Candice's sharp laugh floating just a little too loudly as she made some overdone remark meant to prove everything was fine, and then Michael's deeper, more tired tone layered under hers like a melody always trying to keep up with the noise. I opened the door just as Candice reached the front step, her sunglasses still on, her smile polished, her posture perfect, with not a single strand of hair out of place despite a full day of travel. She had one hand on her youngest shoulder and the other on her suitcase, and for a brief second, when her eyes met mine, I saw it. Just a flicker, a pause, something behind the lenses that recognized I wasn't greeting them the way I used to. I didn't speak. I didn't ask about the trip or pretend to be surprised. I simply held out the envelope with both hands, gently, like one might offer a folded flag or a pressed flower or a final truth, and I watched as her fingers hesitated before taking it. The smile on her face didn't falter at first, but her knuckles tensed slightly, just enough for me to notice, and then she tucked it under her arm without a word and told the girls to go inside. I didn't follow them. I turned and walked back to the kitchen, set the kettle to boil, and listened to the sound of them moving through the house. Children dropping their shoes, Michael's soft voice asking where something was, Candice telling him she needed a minute before unpacking. I imagined her opening that envelope somewhere upstairs, maybe sitting on the edge of their bed or standing by the dresser where she kept her earrings and the perfume she only wore to dinner parties. Her fingers unfolding the page, her eyes scanning the words, her heart skipping when she reached the line that ended it all. I imagined her face changing, not with loud panic, but with the kind of slow, dawning awareness that doesn't come with fire but with frost, creeping in from the edges until the center breaks. I didn't need to see it. I knew exactly how she would react. First denial, then calculation. Maybe she'd try to laugh it off, say the test was a mistake. Maybe she'd accuse me of invasion or obsession. Maybe she'd pretend she didn't know what it meant. But no matter which card she played, the truth was too plain, too stark, too final. She wouldn't be able to talk her way out of this one, and I wasn't going to give her a stage to try. My job wasn't to argue anymore. My job was to let the truth sit in the room with her, like a mirror that refused to soften the reflection. Michael came into the kitchen not long after, still a little sunburned, his arms carrying bags and gifts and small souvenirs wrapped in plastic that he placed gently on the table, as if that would fix something, and I smiled at him. A soft, even smile. One that didn't ask anything or say too much. He looked tired, worn in the way a man gets when he's been trying too hard for too long, and for a moment I wanted to reach out, to pull him into the kind of hug that used to make everything feel safe when he was 6 years old and scared of thunder. But I didn't. I just offered him a cup of tea and asked if the girls enjoyed the cruise, and he nodded like he was answering a question on autopilot, glancing toward the hallway where Candice had gone silent. She didn't come down for dinner. She said she had a headache. I said nothing. Later that night, when the house was quiet again and the children were asleep and Michael had gone out to the porch to take a call, I passed the hallway and noticed the envelope still sitting on their dresser, open now but not hidden, and the piece of paper tucked inside half folded, just enough to see the words. I didn't touch it. I didn't need to. I simply closed their bedroom door with quiet fingers and walked back to my room with the slow satisfaction of someone who has finally stopped trying to be heard and instead chosen to be understood by facts alone. I slept deeply that night, not with peace but with certainty, and when I woke the next morning to the sound of birds and the smell of toast from downstairs, I moved through my house with the quiet confidence of someone who has laid the first stone in a foundation that no one saw coming. There were no raised voices, no slammed doors. Not yet, but the silence had changed. It wasn't dismissive anymore. It was cautious, aware, and in Candice's eyes at breakfast, I saw not the cold dismissal she used to give me, but calculation and fear, the unmistakable expression of someone trying to figure out just how much you know and how far you're willing to go. I buttered my toast slowly and asked the girls if they wanted strawberries, and as Candice looked down at her coffee, her hands slightly shaking, I simply smiled, not to provoke but to remind her that pretending only works when no one's watching, and I had been watching all along. The days that followed moved slowly, like molasses down a cold jar, each moment stretching long and heavy, not because the house was any different on the surface, but because the air between us had changed in a way that couldn't be reversed. Candice had started avoiding eye contact altogether, her movements sharp and clipped, her tone overly polite in that brittle way people speak when they know the ground beneath them is no longer steady. And though Michael didn't say anything directly, I saw it in the way he looked at me during dinner, a flicker of confusion, a quiet concern he didn't know how to name, as if he could feel the current shifting but couldn't yet tell which way the tide would pull. I remained still, calm, pleasant even, folding the laundry, watering the potted orchids near the window and offering warm casseroles without so much as a sideways glance. But behind that composure, I was waiting for the moment when the pressure would reach its edge and the first crack would stop hiding behind civility. That moment came on a Thursday evening just after sunset, when the sky outside turned the color of bruised plum and the wind swept through the trees like a warning. I was in the kitchen clearing the dishes when I heard the back door open sharply, not slammed, but not gently either, and I knew before I turned that it was Candice, her breath uneven, her eyes wild in that specific way people look when they've been cornered by something they can't explain away. She walked toward me with stiff, purposeful steps, clutching the now wrinkled DNA results in her hand, and for a split second, I thought she was going to say something, anything. But instead, she stood there shaking, her mouth opening without sound, her face flushed with something that wasn't quite anger, but wasn't fear either. It was exposure, naked and raw. My hand was still on the faucet, the water running warm over the dishcloth, and in that suspended moment I felt the tension coil so tightly between us that it could have snapped with a single word. I saw her hand clench, her jaw tighten, and I knew if I moved wrong, said something sharp, she'd explode. Maybe even try to turn it all back on me in front of Michael, force a confrontation loud enough to blur the truth with drama. But I didn't flinch. Instead, I turned off the water, dried my hands calmly, and walked past her toward the hallway table where I had quietly placed a second envelope that morning, this one holding the screenshots, the paperwork, and the school records Candice thought no one had seen. I picked it up slowly and handed it to her without a word just as she was about to speak, and that gesture alone stopped her in her tracks. Her hand hovered over it for a moment before she snatched it like it might bite her, and I watched her eyes scan the top page, her breath catching in her throat as she realized this wasn't just about a test anymore. It was about everything. She looked up at me with a new kind of stillness, her voice caught somewhere behind her pride, and for a terrifying second I thought she might scream, throw the pages, accuse me of things I couldn't disprove fast enough, but then the back door opened again and Michael stepped in, holding a bag of groceries and blinking at the two of us like he'd interrupted something he wasn't ready to understand. The air snapped back to normal like a rubber band under tension, and Candice, without missing a beat, turned away, muttering something about needing to lie down, disappearing up the stairs so quickly it almost seemed choreographed. I stood in the kitchen, steadying my breath, pretending to rinse a plate that was already clean, while Michael unpacked lettuce and sandwich bread with the blank movements of a man doing everything he can to avoid sensing what's unraveling behind the silence. He didn't ask what just happened, and I didn't offer. Some things need to simmer longer before the lid can be lifted, and he wasn't ready yet. Not fully. Not until he saw it with his own eyes. That night, after the lights were out and the house had settled into its creaking hush, I stepped out onto the porch wrapped in Martin's old flannel, the fabric soft with age and memory, and I let the breeze cool my skin while I looked out across the dark yard where shadows bent between trees, like old ghosts. My heart was steady, but I knew we were close now, close to the moment when the walls she'd built around her lies would start to fall in full view, and Michael, finally, would have no choice but to see. I wasn't angry. I wasn't triumphant. I was simply ready. Because the storm didn't come that night, not quite, but the wind had shifted, and the sky no longer felt safe. The following morning carried that strange stillness that only appears when a house holds too many unspoken things, the kind of quiet that isn't restful but tense, stretched tight across every surface like a sheet pulled too far across a bed. The girls were cheerful as ever, their small voices bouncing off the kitchen walls as they ate cereal and argued softly over who would get the pink bowl. But their mother moved through the room like a shadow trying not to be seen, avoiding my eyes, her motions too precise, too cautious, as if she knew she was now walking across thin ice and every step left a mark. Michael noticed, that much was clear. He watched her with a quiet hesitation I hadn't seen in him for years, like something inside him was flickering awake after too long in the dark. And though he didn't say anything yet, his eyes carried questions he didn't know how to shape into words. I didn't push. I didn't prod. I simply buttered the toast, poured the juice, and sat at the table with them as if nothing at all had changed. Because the closer you are to the truth, the quieter you have to be to let it land without resistance. Later that day, when Michael had taken the girls to their piano lessons, Candice approached me with the careful composure of someone who'd been rehearsing for hours, and I could feel her gathering whatever strength she had left behind her painted face and carefully chosen blouse. But her confidence was different now, frayed at the edges, almost desperate. She stood in the doorway of the living room holding a manila folder in her hand, and for a split second, I thought perhaps she'd come to apologize, to confess, to admit what we both already knew had become undeniable. But instead, she stepped forward and tried to flip the script in the only way she knew how. By handing me a document, one she claimed proved that Michael was, in fact, the father, a second test. Privately done, conveniently timed, results that told a different story entirely. She said little, but her expression said everything. Smugness forced through fear, a cornered animal bluffing its way to safety. I took the folder from her hands without speaking, opened it and scanned the page slowly, my eyes moving line by line as her posture straightened behind me, waiting for the moment she thought I would stumble. But what she didn't expect, what she couldn't have imagined, was that I had already seen this exact document before, months ago, during one of her early attempts to forge paperwork for a school form that Margaret's cousin had intercepted and quietly flagged. It wasn't just false, it was amateur. The template was outdated, the formatting didn't match the lab's official layout, and the reference ID at the top had already been linked to another case entirely, which meant she hadn't just lied, she'd used someone else's record and changed the name. I closed the folder gently and looked at her for a long moment, not with anger, not even with judgment, but with something that must have unsettled her more deeply. Disappointment without reaction. I didn't speak. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't accuse. I simply turned and walked to my bedroom, opened my own cabinet, and pulled out the original certified results, placing them side by side on the table in the living room. I didn't call her to look. I let her come. And when she did, the color in her face shifted just slightly, a small betrayal her body gave before her voice could spin a story. And for the first time, I saw something break. Not loudly, not completely, but enough. She knew I had her. She just didn't know how I would use it. Michael came home early that evening, earlier than expected, and he walked into that moment without knowing it was one. The two envelopes sitting open on the table, his wife standing still as glass, me quietly dusting the bookshelf like nothing unusual was happening at all. He paused, looked at the papers, then at Candice, then at me, and though he didn't say a word, I saw it. That shift, that slow, heartbreaking flicker behind his eyes as a dozen questions rushed in at once, and all the soft, believable stories she'd ever told him started to collapse under their own weight. He asked what was going on, but his voice didn't sound like his own. It sounded like a man trying to keep the world from tilting too far. Candice responded first. Too quickly, with a tremble in her voice she tried to disguise as indignation, launching into a messy explanation about misinformation, fake results, and personal boundaries being crossed. But her words hit the floor like dropped glass, shiny but broken, and impossible to put back together. Michael looked at her the way a man looks at someone he's loved for years and is just now realizing he may not truly know. He turned to me then, his eyes searching, confused, unsure. And though I didn't speak, I gently handed him my copy, the certified one, the only one that didn't need embellishment or defense. He took it with trembling hands and sat down slowly, reading it in silence as the room pulsed with tension too thick to breathe. For a moment I feared the worst, that he would snap at me, accuse me of sabotage, of trying to ruin what little was left of his peace. But he didn't. He just sat there, still and pale. And when he finally set the papers down, he didn't look at either of us. He just said he needed air and stepped outside, leaving the door open behind him. The screen door swung once, twice, and the night swallowed him whole. Candice stood frozen for a while, then turned and walked away, her steps quiet, her head down. I remained in the living room, alone now, the last light from the window catching the edge of the folder, as if to remind me that even in silence, the truth had finally found its place. The house stayed strangely quiet after Michael stepped outside, the kind of silence that hums in your ears when you know something important is about to shift, but can't yet tell which way it will land. Candice disappeared into the guest room, not their bedroom, maybe out of guilt, maybe out of calculation, but I didn't follow. I remained seated in the living room, listening to the creak of the screen door, the faint whistle of wind slipping in through the slightly open window, and the steady ticking of the old mantel clock that had seen more family stories unfold than any of us ever realized. Hours passed like fog rolling through a field, and when Michael finally came back inside, his steps were slow, his face unreadable, and though he nodded at me faintly as he walked toward the stairs, he didn't say a word. The folder was still on the table. He didn't touch it. The next morning, nothing happened. No confrontation, no demands, no suitcase being wheeled out dramatically, just normalcy, but off by a degree, like a photograph slightly out of focus. Days went by that way. Michael barely spoke to Candice. She kept her distance, floating around the house like a ghost who didn't know where to settle. I wondered if maybe he had decided to pretend nothing happened, to preserve the illusion for the sake of the children or the quiet. And a part of me started to brace for that possibility, that the truth, no matter how clear, might still be buried for the sake of keeping things easy. But what I didn't know, what none of us saw coming, was that Michael wasn't ignoring anything. He was watching, learning, remembering, and he was planning, just like I had. 1 week later, on a breezy Saturday morning, while Candice was at the hair salon and the girls were playing outside, Michael quietly came into the kitchen, poured himself a cup of coffee, and sat down across from me. He looked tired, but there was something new in his expression. Stillness, but sharper, like stone that had finally settled after years of shifting. He told me, carefully and without theatrics, that he'd made an appointment with a family attorney, that he'd taken a second test, official and private, and that the results confirmed what mine had said. Every line, every number, every unspoken truth. He had waited, he said, not because he didn't believe me, but because he had to be sure for himself, because he knew that once he stepped across that line, there would be no way back, and he didn't want to cross it without both eyes open. But then came the part I never expected. He told me he'd been collecting too. Financial statements, text backups, photos Candice thought were deleted, messages from the man she'd been seeing, bank transfers she couldn't explain, and even voice memos she'd accidentally recorded on her phone while venting to her sister about how easy it had been to manipulate him. It was more than betrayal. It was strategy. She had been building her own exit plan for over a year, waiting to corner him legally while still milking his income and controlling the narrative, and the only reason she hadn't moved sooner was because she thought I was too soft, too old, too irrelevant to interfere. Michael said he'd already moved their joint funds into a protected account, that the lawyer had filed papers, and that Candice would be served the following Monday with a complete breakdown of her lies, documented, notarized, and structured in a way that would leave her with no room to fight. But that wasn't the part that broke me. What did was when he reached across the table, placed his hand gently on mine, and thanked me. Not just for protecting him, but for doing it without demanding to be seen, without shouting for credit, just quietly, steadily, like a mother does when no one is watching. And then came the second twist, the one even I hadn't seen coming. Later that week, when Candice received the papers and the truth hit her like a wave she couldn't outrun, she did exactly what I expected. Cried, shouted, begged, spun her stories so fast even she couldn't keep up. But Michael didn't budge. He told her she could stay in the house for a few weeks to find her footing, for the children's sake, but she would have no control, no access, no say in anything else. What neither of them expected, though, was the letter that arrived 2 days later, a thick white envelope from the private school Candice had manipulated with her false documents, one she thought she had outsmarted with her carefully constructed image. They had launched an internal audit after receiving an anonymous tip, mine, of course, and after comparing her claims with public records and financial inconsistencies, the school not only revoked all aid, but reported her for potential fraud, quietly but firmly, and suddenly the path she'd paved for herself was no longer a smooth one lined with excuses, but a steep incline she could no longer climb. She would be investigated, her reputation would fracture, and her easy exit would become a long, humiliating descent, and I didn't celebrate it. I didn't gloat. I simply continued folding laundry in my room while the sound of her panic echoed faintly through the hallway, like the last gasp of a story she could no longer write herself into. Weeks passed, papers were signed, the house grew lighter, the girls smiled more. Michael began to breathe again, and one afternoon as we stood together watching the youngest draw chalk flowers on the sidewalk, he said he was planning to start over. Not just legally, but personally, and he wanted me to stay, not just as a guest, but as family, part of the core again, not pushed to the edges, but centered where I had always belonged. He said he'd been asleep too long, and that maybe it took everything falling apart for him to finally wake up. And so I stayed. I kept cooking, kept tending the orchids, kept listening to music as I cleaned the kitchen. But now there was laughter again, real laughter. And for the first time in a long while, the home felt like something alive and honest, not a stage set for a woman playing family while erasing its roots. If you've ever been made to feel small in your own story, if you've ever been written out of a life you helped build, let me ask you this. What would you have done? Would you have stayed silent? Or would you have waited for the moment the truth could speak louder than any scream? I didn't destroy her. I just let her truth come to light. And sometimes that's more powerful than any revenge.